these are the people that whom you see on the screen right now are the actual application owners. They have their company. They all have different solutions that are built on the blockchain technology. And we would like to zero in more on different aspects of all the applications that we could be building, or some of the cautionary tales maybe even that we need to watch out for. And we can actually hear all these things from the actual people who have the actual solution. So we would like to start the session, the real application owner story. So let's start with the introduction of each panelist today, because like I said, they all have a different solution. They all target sort of different industry, different markets. So it really makes sense if we can have each panelist introduce who they are and what kind of solution they have. And we will just go in the order of last name, alphabetical last name order. So Mao, could we start with you to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so thanks for coming to the panel, everyone. I'm Mao Hu. I'm a co-founder and COO at Quora. And Quora's goal is really to provide low cost and equal access to financial services. And so what we're doing is we're building a blockchain network on top of which we're embedding functionality for identity, for money transfer, or for creating cooperative financial systems like trade unions. And we're so anyone on the blockchain can access this functionality at the same cost. And then we're helping people access the blockchain without internet by going through telecom networks. So we have a beta going on in Nigeria right now. We're helping 300 farmers get paid, and we have quite a few other projects coming up this year.
Great, thank you. And then for the audience sake, actually Mao doesn't have an access to camera right now. So the person who is not on the screen was the one who was speaking just now. And Daniel, I do apologize. In a Roman alphabet world, D comes before H. But pardon me, I'm a Japanese. I got it confused. Daniel, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah. Thanks, and thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone for joining the panel. So I'm Daniel Jur. I'm the CEO and co-founder of PaperChain. So we're building a liquidity platform that allows digital media companies to create asset packages from their media transactions and stuff them on a decentralized marketplace. So the marketplace is based on a factoring model, which will allow token holders to come in and buy these media transaction asset packages. And basically the goal is to help creative companies, whether they're distributors or labels or publishers, allows them to turn their future receivables into working capital months ahead of current digital media pay cycles. We're in early stage development at the moment. We've spent probably the last 16 months working in the right management space, but the problem of cash flow was something that kept coming up. So we're looking at an alternative means of funding the digital media industry.
Thank you, Daniel. Adi?
Sure. Hi, my name is Adi Siegel, and I am with See-Through. See-Through is working on a transparent healthcare platform that allows for direct payments between providers and patients. In a country like the Bahamas, this can be used very easily for things like elective procedures. Most things with your great and new innovative system are generally covered. But what it can in the Bahamas actually allow you to do, if you want, is actually bring in a lot of outside patients who can actually supercharge your healthcare system, because you have a highly funded system in your country, and other people who can't afford it, let's say in America, can use our platform to find the same quality care in the Bahamas at a fraction of the price that they would need to get it in America. And just so you understand, just briefly, why we're working on America first as a platform that is really a global solution to democratize healthcare, because in America, the healthcare expenditure out of pocket is $5 billion per year. It's 20% of our GDP. And there's a whole other industry called revenue cycle management, which is a $9 billion industry. The whole thing equates to over $3.7 trillion. So there's a lot of money wasted, and we can cut that out with a blockchain solution we can talk to later. The idea is that we make healthcare more accessible to both Americans and people around the world. And we're excited to see how we can work with the Bahamas, not necessarily on our platform, but just in general, using blockchain in healthcare.
Thank you, Eddie. And last but not least, Fanny, and I would like to say something. When we talk about technology and the business owners and things like that, the female founders, female executives, just for your information, it's only about, I don't know, somewhere between 10 to 20%, depending on the resources that you read about. So Fanny, thank you so much for being the part of this panel, where I have a rare occasion to have a female panelist along with me, so welcome.
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for also seeing another a female face moderating, because oftentimes that's also very important, so that we make sure that the conversation is geared in the right direction. So I'm Fanny Wang. I'm a founding member of the ICSO network. So ICSO is building a blockchain protocol for what we call the impact economy. And by that, what we mean is, how do we start valuing all these different other sustainable development and social impact goals, especially around the sustainable development goals that the UN has put out. How do we start measuring all of the good stuff that people are doing that's currently not being valued in traditional capital markets? And we can use the power of blockchain as a auditing tool, but also the power of the tokenization process and crypto markets as a way to rethink the economy around valuing these new kinds of impacts and sustainable development goals. So what our protocol allows any party to do is to collect data about its project's results and its outcomes. So you can quantify all different kinds of measures, whether it's carbon offsets, health impacts, gender impacts, and other kinds of measures that are important to a particular project. That information gets validated and tokenized into digital assets that can then be traded or exchanged and funded, and allows an interface for sharing your underlying project data and a potential way to monetize that data. So we've got a couple of live projects. Our first project is called Amply, which was a project that was supported by UNICEF Innovation Fund. And this project is tokenizing preschool attendance records in South Africa, which are then exchanged for funding from the South African government. And we've got a number of exciting new additional pilot projects to test out various different kinds of use cases using the ICSO protocol.
Great, thank you for that introduction, you all. So now let's start getting into the nuts and bolts of each application, okay? So let's start with you, Mama. Amongst other things, as we spoke when we first spoke to each other, or when we had our first call, Bahamas is thinking about, amongst other things, using this for the financial services. And given what you are doing, I know that your Cora is beginning to branch out to other areas as well. But please tell us what Cora is trying to do, what it has achieved, where it's going.
Yeah, so ultimately, from an economic perspective, what we're trying to do with Cora is minimize the cost to serve, to make it accessible to everyone to access Cora and use that to access financial services. Because for a bank to operate their IT, between licensing fees, between building their own technology, between their operations teams, it gets quite expensive. And that accounts for a lot of the overhead that drives up the cost to serve. Having physical branches also drives up the cost to serve. And so we're really trying to take out costs wherever we can. And by providing this turnkey access to financial services and making that open source and available to everyone. And by doing so, we're trying to make the core network essentially the lowest common denominator, where people can connect and access all kinds of financial services providers. On top of that, it's also very important for us that our users' financial data meets obviously regulatory concerns as well as privacy concerns. So the way our identity system works, users have both privacy over their data. So it can only be accessed and amended with use of our private key, while the financial services provider that they would be working with, which is presumably some regulated entity, would also have their own copy. So if if the regulator wants to audit this entity, they have the records. And ultimately, we're just using the blockchain almost as a trust machine to verify that this particular payload happened at a certain point in time. And so by adding those together, we're trying to create what we consider a more inclusive and a more kind of user-centric financial system.
Great, Momo, thank you. And let's go to you now, Fanny, because we are going to kind of continue with this sort of working with the smaller nations, dealing with the sort of government, sort of central authority theme. So your solution, your first solution is digital ID solution, which the Bahamas may, as the first step into the blockchain world at the nation level, might be looking into. So could you explain what you had to do in order to get the solution going, what you have to be mindful of as you kind of go to that direction?
Yeah, so I think the emerging standards around identity is this idea of around self-sovereign identity, that you should be able to own your own identity credentials. In the current world, that's not how it works. You get issued, let's say, a social security number or a state ID and so forth, and that data is owned by the state or the entity that issued that information. So how can we, especially in more vulnerable populations where you might see less state, right, or statelessness, start giving people control and access over some kind of identity. So the standards that we see are emerging around that is called decentralized identifiers, or DID standards. So it's a framework, it's a technical framework, but it's also a set of principles around who owns their information and data. And in our specific context, it's quite important to have the identity layer, because that underpins all of your provenance for who's making claims about what happened, or what effects were achieved, where, for whom, which beneficiaries, and so forth. So in the case of Amply, we've created a mobile interface that allows teachers to create digital or decentralized IDs for the kids. They're cute little kids. They're 5 years old, and they've got a digital ID. So that helps us to see if there's duplications in the attendance records, so it reduces those human errors, it reduces potential fraud in those attendance records, and so the digital identity standard is really, really key, and it's the elephant in the room with a lot of these kinds of new blockchain processes, and be able to identify in a privacy-preserving way who is signing off on a particular claim, who signed off on a particular transaction. So the DIDs are pseudonyms. They are, kind of these hashed long, numbers and letters and so forth. That's points to a set of underlying data where the data is stored and so forth. And so all of the actual personal identifying information is stored off-chain. And the DIDs then allow a way to interface with the blockchain to show who's been given access to the underlying data, and to revoke that access. So it's also a control mechanism around sensitive data. So I think this is a very, very core part of the new web infrastructure as we move away from sort of traditional Web 2.0 models where the platforms own your data, right? That the Facebooks of the world own your data, to now having that sort of self-sovereign, I own my data, and that starts with having the identities.
Great, thank you, Fanny. I mean, I'm actually glad that you brought up about the mobile aspect of what you guys are doing in Africa, because we actually touched upon a little bit of that subject in the earlier session, that the regions like Africa, how it leapfrogged by having the mobile technology, by not needing to build out the infrastructure for the actual sort of landline phones. And now with blockchain, I mean, how you are trying to leverage the mobile to kind of simplify access to data or access to technology. So thank you for bringing that up. And just to round up on this dealing with the nations like Africa, Mao and Fanny, I assume that you are dealing with the organizations like United Nations, probably to a certain extent the government of each country where you are in. So could you kind of explain what the process is like in order to have this technology not led by, but getting the central authority involved, what it's like? And Ari and Daniel, from your perspective, if you can kind of comment after they finish, if you can touch upon sort of disintermediation nature of the technology, because this is somewhat, for lack of better words, dichotomy of where we are trying to go. So if you can comment on that one.
Sure.
So I guess I'll go first.
Go ahead, Mama.
When we're deploying it, go back to the cycle. When we were deploying in Nigeria, it was very crucial for us to get local partners. So we have, for example, we have a payments processor partner. We have a farming aggregator partner. They're the actual co-op whose farmers we're working with. We work with an IMTO there that's licensed to do agency banking. And we work with a telecom API provider to get access to those networks. And each, the API provider is licensed. Obviously, the telecom, say, plugins are licensed. The IMTO we work with is licensed. We have had some discussions with the CPN, the Central Bank of Nigeria, which are really just kind of informational, just kind of giving them some information on what we do. It hasn't really progressed that much, but we do know that they are watching the space quite closely. And obviously, and just for a quick note on disintermediation, in my opinion, blockchain could actually be a huge benefit to central banks. If you look at the so-called cryptocurrency ecosystem, no one trusts any of these currencies. Bitcoin is kind of close as you get to some kind of reserve currency, and Bitcoin has crazy amounts of currency fluctuation. So for a central bank to come in and say, I am going to back this cryptocurrency, and that could very easily be the centerpiece in this cryptocurrency world. And obviously, the only issue at that point is you have to ensure the currency is being used for legitimate purposes. And so that's kind of my view. It's still, I think, quite a while away before we have those kind of discussions in areas we're deploying in, but we do make sure that we're operating inside regulatory frameworks.
So, Fanny.
Yeah, I can talk. So in South Africa, I think the trick was when we started, it wasn't quite a fully a total. We started actually in 2016 with the project in South Africa with Ampli, and so at that point, I think the trick was saying, well, we're just digitizing your preschool attendance records, and it wasn't quite really a blockchain thing yet, and then it became a blockchain thing. So maybe that was the trick of getting them kind of in the door. I think you have to find spaces within different government organizations that are more willing to experiment. And you start kind of small with a pilot, because there's always this excitement, I think, around new technologies, but there's also a sense of risk. Well, if this fails, then I was worse off than before, and how does that going to look internally for me, right? So you always have to find little small projects that are good showcase projects and use cases that might be relatively low risk compared to the current situation that is present. So, with the preschool attendance records, there were thousands and thousands of paper records that were still being filled out. The teachers hated it because it took time out of their day. And then as the government, you have to manually process all these attendance records and manually process all the payments out of that. So if you can touch on these kind of pain points, right, where they're ready to actually experiment and try something new, whereas the worst case is no worse than our current situation, right? And there's something interesting here that we want to try. So that's where you kind of build, and you have to build by doing the work. And there's a lot of hype and talk about blockchain, and actually, shockingly, a very few projects have actually gone out into the field and implemented use cases. So if you can just demonstrate with traction that you're actually building things, that you're actually driving that value, then you gain that credibility to be able to do more within the government. But sometimes it's kind of funny because government agencies, well, we still need a PDF. We still literally need that PDF to satisfy these reporting requirements. And then we're like, okay, well, we'll do everything on the blockchain using smart contracts, but we'll print you a PDF as well so that you can satisfy your requirements.
Yeah, I mean, you were getting a little laughter on this side, Fanny, as you commented on that one. The Bahamas is in a little bit different situation because this is really sort of government-led. I shouldn't say government-led initiative, but the central authority is definitely in, and they really want to move this forward. So I think the difference here is that the nation is in, and now how do we kind of educate everyone around?
Yeah.
Plus, it's kind of like, there are so many different things that we can do. That where do we start?
Yeah.
So that was a really interesting point that you brought up. So with that note, Daniel and Adi, I mean, you have the sort of private sector, if you will, the solution. And like I was saying earlier, disintermediation is really the whole sort of thing about the blockchain, how it started. So we are beginning to have this dichotomy with some of the nations or some of the places. The central authority is stepping in to make sure that the nation can actually get on this advanced technology. So how would you, I mean, do you have some comment about that, either one of you?
Sure. So
Yeah. Do you want to go, Addy?
yeah, sure. So healthcare is actually a great place to start. And before today, I was looking at the initiatives for the new Bahama health system, and two of them really stuck out to me and how blockchain can be part of it. One is health records, and two is identity, and really using technology to transform the future of healthcare. So it's a problem in almost every country is the ownership of healthcare data. Usually it is inside a silo, and the silo can be a paper record like Fenny was mentioning, where even if you have an electronic system, for some reason you need a printout as a PDF, and then it's put in literally a manila folder into a file cabinet. And then it's stuck there. And if you go from one hospital to the other, you can't get your records, even in socialized national systems or single payer systems. So what blockchain can allow you to do is put those records out there, and the records do actually, or they should, belong to the patient. And so you allow the patient to have access to that, and they can go to every provider with their record. And all they need is that other part, which is the identity. Who is this patient? And as Penny was saying, it can be done pseudonymously, because most people are not going to figure out the 62-character serial number of a patient. And so only the patient knows what their number is, and they can provide what's called their public key to the health system. And what that allows you to do too, and this is another part that I believe the Bahamas is working on, is population health. Now, all of the information is in one place, regardless of where you were treated, and you can start figuring out what's going on really with large data sets in terms of where people are getting sick, how they're getting sick, how can we deal with this? Blockchain is a really good place to put all that information in a private, public manner.
Great, thank you, Adi. And Daniel, that brings to you. I mean, but that was a really sort of funny comment about the 62 digits. I mean, I can never type these things right, so I will be sure to be typing somebody else's private key number. Yeah, with that comment, Daniel.
You're right to point out, Rumi, that it's an interesting dichotomy. And as Mama pointed out, there may be value in a central bank coming and backing a currency. It just depends on how you like to approach it. And you may find, like, people who signed on to Bitcoin, especially early on, they're philosophically they're trying to avoid that sort of traditional financial system. So in that instance, you would probably lose those users of the network. But at the same time, they're probably not your customers anyway. So that's not really going to be a big loss if a central bank was to come in and control the cash flow of a cryptocurrency. That is just about, you may start to find you will get institutional investors, institutional funding coming back to networks. So that may suit you better. It's just a matter of figuring out how you think you would add value in controlling or controlling the flow of money in a space like that, and then working out, who are the people you're actually targeting to use it. Some people philosophically will be against it and wouldn't use it. because they're trying to avoid those traditional systems of control where they saw things leading to the global financial crisis and the bits that were happening in the UK and in the US. They tried to create an alternative financial system because of that. And those people probably wouldn't go for essentially a central bank backed cryptocurrency. But again, they may not be your customers anyway.
Yeah, interesting comment there, Daniel. So thank you on that. And I'm sure we have a lot of cake that we just chewed, a cookie that we just chewed. I like sweets, so whenever we talk about sort of food metaphor, it comes down to cookies or cakes that we have to kind of think about as we chew them on. So Adi, you were talking about the healthcare solution, and I'm sure it's the same all around the world, but healthcare, along with finance in the US, are two most rigorously regulated industries. That means, we have to think about security regardless of what we do, but as part of building your solution, Adi, you probably had to add in an additional measure of security into your system. So can you can you talk a little bit about that? Because security obviously is a very, very high concern of everyone.
Yeah, sure. So part of it is that we don't keep all the data. We have HIPAA in the United States, and actually part of our goal as a payment processor and data processor is that we don't own the data and we don't keep it. So we kind of separate the data into different places. So it's connected, but it doesn't live in one place. That's one way to be very secure. The other is simply developing with what are called the HL7 or FHIR standards. And those are standards that were set out by the ONC, which is part of our health system in the United States. And they basically say that any technology that's involved needs to be compliant and on those protocols. That said, they don't really talk about blockchain. So there are new actual blockchain companies developing healthcare blockchain protocols. But the idea here is that because it's on blockchain, one, everything is pseudonymous, so you'll never have a name attached to a person. You'll have an identity, but not a name, so it's very hard to, if you wanted, you could probably, if you tried really, really hard, you could triangulate, say, your neighbor. If you happen to know that they were going to the gastroenterologist, the primary care doctor, and an imaging center all in the same week, and you spent a lot of time looking at blockchain transactions, you might be able to figure it out. But in terms of a big data breach that we've heard about things around the world, that's most likely, I don't want to make absolute statements, but most likely not going to happen with a blockchain solution. From our perspective, we are a payment processor because we believe that the first thing in terms of eliminating barriers to care is actually the cost of care, certainly in the States and in many systems around the world. And I think that's a really easy way actually for the Bahamas to get involved. You can look at internal solutions, but you can also make yourselves a leader in healthcare delivery for citizens of the globe. It's a great place to come on vacation, and it's an even better place to get, say, hip surgery and recover. So I think I would start getting into that mindset. Put your prices transparent because you already know your prices. It's a national system. You know what you would charge someone if they weren't a citizen, and just make that available to the world. And I think you could see yourselves becoming a big player in healthcare, especially since you're not that far from the States, where it's very expensive for a lot of this care in the current system.
Yeah, I think Bahamas might be only the country where we can actually take a day trip on the sailboat, right, from the United States. So you're absolutely right. It's very close. And also, I think the Bahamas indeed is trying to be a leader of this region. So I think you're right on that comment. One of the things that I have to always think about security, when I think about security, is that in the United States, everything is linked to the social security number. So if you get social security taken somehow, your life might as well be over. And same thing with like fingerprints. I mean, I know that it's encrypted with 16-digit code, but 16-digit code, it's just a code. It's still breakable. So what happens if I get my fingerprints stolen, right? I mean, a social security number, you might be able to beg the government and get the new one, but fingerprints, am I going to burn my finger and get a new fingerprint? I don't know. I mean, that always scares me. So security aspect is extremely important. So thank you for sharing the thoughts that went through. So Dan, I mean, as we talk about the blockchain, we always talk about financial services. Healthcare is definitely up and coming, and a few other applications. Supply chain, although it's a very, very obvious one, it's not something that everybody talks about. So you have a very interesting solution there. And then also the fact that your supply chain does work, I mean, it's a music industry indeed that you cover. And it's an entertainment industry. Bahamas GDP, for about almost half of it comes from the tourism. So I think there are a lot of things that we can think about that are applicable for what we could be doing outside the financial services system. So if you can talk a little bit more about your application.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, for a long time, dealing with the rights management space. So looking at ownership of compositions and recordings, and, if anyone there is involved with the music industry, it's just, and there's a lot of issues that involved. And so we had to get some of that, and we took it as we could. What happening in that space, the industry knows it has issues around ownership, IP, 30-40% of publishing catalog changes every year, so there's a huge administrative overhead of actually updating records. I was talking to someone at Disney who said they get 40% of the checks they receive a year for royalty payments in there, so they have to keep saying this, we don't own it anymore. This idea, the promise is the idea of a distributed ledger that can validate rights and information across all of the various areas, and come the music or any sort of media is very interesting. There's also situations outside that more ticketing, for example, ticketing management for scalping, venue management for bookings, city management, which there's applications for tourism there. It's not just about those direct line caps like ticketing and management, financial supply industry. What I can show, how is the managed?
Dan, sorry to interrupt. Daniel, sorry to interrupt, but we are breaking up quite a bit. Can you check your Wi-Fi strength or however you're connecting right now? Is that do you have full?
Yeah. Okay, just on my webcam maybe, and that will it'll just be, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that might be better. I think you might be having a little issue there. And now I think it's sounding better. So if you can kind of take maybe 1-2 minutes back and kind of explain what you were explaining. Yeah. Again, sorry about that.
Yeah, so there's a big application within rights management. Here, for example, someone in every year, 30 or 40% of the checks they receive, they have to send back because they don't own that anymore. So the ownership is very fluid. There's a lot of intermediaries, society, complex Spotify that need information, but there's no natural way for them to share that currently. So that's a blockchain. Outside of rights ticketing for provenance ownership to try and tackle scalping. On the supply chain side, there's management for bookings and capacity and also as part of that, for when it comes to live shows, merchandise that comes in there, the comes in there, what sort of supply chain are they putting on the equipment and sort of manage the crew that needs to build to equipment from state to state. The idea of a distributed ledger that could have great efficiency in how those processes get managed is the real promise. So it's not a lot of the, direct above the line categories. It's also things that happen in the internal side of where there's opportunity. And that's just not for music industry, that's for many industries. Digital advertising ad fraud is a huge issue. 50% of media budget can be wasted on bot traffic. So it goes back to the identity point, is how can we verify users in the digital space that can solve issues like that. And wide supply chain use cases. I mean, British Airways developed a proof for how they could use shared for flight info to confirmation that gets sent through an airport. So again, it's not, they're not big tickets, but those are small little where you can implement some sort of autonomous process that can make those processes more efficient. Is loyalty program may replace reward points. That becomes the token for value. customers. There's application there for businesses, but also for tourism. How you can capacity for example, if there's a certain in town, to have a picture of capacity management and make a better experience for trying to visit the customers. Because it's not just a matter of just accepting Bitcoin Ethereum as payments and saying you're trying to do something on blockchain. You're really trying to do a business process, and that's a lot of what technology blockchain ways do.
Thank you, Daniel. You're still breaking up a little bit. It sounded a little better without the picture, but still you were breaking up a bit. So if you could check if you can kind of move your computer around, I don't know, for the signal, better signal or whatever it is. We're in 21st century, but we're still dealing with the very technology, right? So so this is a question for all of you. If you have any sort of interesting answer, that is, I'm sure you had a problem first that you were trying to solve rather than, oh, I have this thing called blockchain. What can I do with it, right? But are there, other than what you kind of are developing now, are there any other applications or industries that you kind of looked at, considered because they were also having problems where blockchain can be, you thought the blockchain can be a very interesting solution? Okay.
Didn't really look at just applying. Sorry, go.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Daniel.
I was just saying, was not really looking for any solution. Obviously, we're looking to solve problems that we had come across in industries we were working in, so that being the music industry. But as you're building it, you're obviously thinking about other industries that also have the same challenges. And when it comes to the way a lot of digital media works, particularly in the way data is delivered, and then also how it is tracked, whether it's impression or stream data, for example, for a song or for a piece of digital advertising or a film on Netflix, a lot of the supply chain, the digital supply chain in those industries is starting to become very similar. So if you can solve one of them, you can solve multiple.
That's a really, go ahead. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
So I was going to say, I think you can break it down into two different things, which is, some of our companies are working on global impact and others are working on kind of like industry needs. So on the global impact side, and Fenny's, it seems like, is doing this a little bit, or a lot. I need to learn more about her company, quite honestly. But if every person was born onto the blockchain, we would have no issues with immigration. We would have no issues with people losing identity and like not knowing where they're from. So we could ultimately one day have global citizens. That's very idealist, obviously. And you can do that for anything, right? So anything, a lot of people care about where their food comes from today. And Bahamas produces some food, especially some tropical foods. So, and people want to know where it comes from. So a great example would be kind of tagging stuff from the very beginning, and you can follow how your food was produced, what are the labor practices on those different farms and plantations. A lot of neat stuff going on there. Places where I think it's less kind of, quote unquote, impactful in the world, but could have a lot of financial impact or be quite fruitful, so to speak, would be wine and the provenance of wine, or art. These are places where it's often disputed where the given item came from. Like, is a Picasso really a Picasso? Or the 200-year-old red wine that came from Italy, is it actually that, or is it water that was recorked and then you just bought it for $1 million? I think those are places where we might see it happen. I bet the people who are working on the internet at first didn't expect that selling books would lead to the giant on the internet. But look, now Jeff Bezos is the most brilliant man of the internet and the king of the internet, because he figured out how to take one problem that didn't seem like a problem to most of us and make it into every single service. And we basically all live on Amazon today. And we don't even realize that the biggest part of their services are the Amazon Web Services. So when you think about, the other thing to really notice is, when you think about where we are in blockchain technology, we're probably in 1993 or 1994 of the internet. The big giants of the internet, or now the big giants of blockchain, probably don't exist yet. Now, hopefully our ventures will make it through what will probably be the burst of the next bubble. But we are going to see companies that don't even exist right now have some of the biggest impact. We're just very early on, and it's hard to know where we're going with this, aside from believing in the technology and knowing that it's the next generation.
Fantastic.
You know, for me, like a personal kind of interest has always been around governance. You know, whether or not we can use something like the blockchain,
Did we
or really
hack?
any kind of system to make it to make better decisions together. You know, I think that as like, you know, sometimes I had a few discussions with people around this concept of universal basic income. You know, where it's like, okay, as we have all this wealth, how can we distribute it fairly? But to me, universal basic income has never been a problem with like the mechanism we use to distribute it. It's really been a problem of how can we as a society agree collectively that, you know, people are entitled to a certain standard of living. And I think, you know, with the blockchains, what you can do is you can develop a commons that has trust, that you can trust the commons. You can't necessarily trust every single person there, but you can trust statements and actions that they have committed to the commons. And so, and there are ways to design those systems that align everyone's incentives to benefit the system as a whole instead of yourself. And so to me, the biggest question has been, can we use these kind of systems to come close together as a people and, you know, collectively agree to act more altruistically? And I think projects like Culture Network and BitNation are doing really exciting work on this front. But I think, you know, to me, that might be one of the most exciting uses of blockchain, even beyond financial services.
So for us, especially my founder, who spent 25 years in the public health space, he was one of the first people to come up with treatment standards and access to care for AIDS and HIV in South Africa in the late 90s, early 2000s. So constantly the issue that you come into within the development sector is, you know, how do we design good incentives and good governance around where funding goes and to make sure that funding goes to projects that are actually successful and effective. So there's been an innovation around pay for success and pay for performance, or sometimes called results-based finance. You saw the advent of the first social and development impact bonds. That was a relatively recent phenomenon, I think, back in 2014. So very, very innovative incentives and mechanisms. But we still don't have very good tools to cost effectively evaluate and measure and transact on the impacts that we're looking to achieve. And so this is what we see as the revolution with not just blockchain technologies, but a whole suite of Web3 technologies. How do you marry performance accounting with financial accounting, right? So you have smart contracts that can link, hopefully in the future, on-chain payments using stable coins, or if the Bahamian dollar became a digital Bahamian dollar, which you see happening in the Caribbean with de-risking of Caribbean banks. So there's a whole range of possibilities of being to link payments directly to proof of impact, proof that these outcomes were indeed achieved according to a set of standards. So one of the we talk about supply chain, right? Like, is the wine really the real wine versus being corked, right? So when you start the tokenization process, there's an added complexity layer there. With Bitcoin and Ether, they're only digital assets. So everything can be done on chain in terms of the genesis of these digital assets, in terms of the transactions of these digital assets, and the validation of those transactions. But when the digital asset represents a real world asset, you have to have some kind of evaluation mechanism in the real world to say, okay, well, the two are linked, that this digital asset indeed represents this particular artwork or this house or the fact that these kids went to school, right? So this is a question that we get a lot in terms of, well, how do you make sure that these kids are actually going to school? How do you make sure that someone's actually using these clean burning cook stoves so that we can actually certify these carbon offsets and these health impacts and so forth, right? And I think this is where things get really interesting, exciting, and that's going to require a suite of different technologies coming together, with blockchain serving as as kind of a substrate, if you will, like as an infrastructure that can hold all these different data sets. So our thesis is that you're going to see growth in IoT. IoT devices. So an example that we have of a project to originate carbon offsets from clean burning cook stoves. We're working with the Gold Standard Foundation. They're a carbon certification body, and NextLeaf. They are amongst other things, they make IoT sensors specifically for these cook stoves. So you can generate automatic claims about the cook stove's usage and the air quality around the cook stove from these IoT sensors. And what blockchain will do and what our protocol will do is capture those claims in a standardized data object, in a standardized data template, fed along with other data requirements for the certification process. You feed that through a smart contract, and you can automatically then generate these carbon tokens, which can now be traded peer-to-peer. So hopefully that adds more liquidity and therefore more financing for these types of projects, right? And part of the evaluation capabilities, you're going to now reduce the need for the manual evaluation, someone coming in every week to check, are you using the cook stoves, right? So now we have an automatic way of capturing that information that's more transparent and more accurate. And we're also looking at, how do you think about using AI and machine learning, right? So evaluation will become more data-driven. So, for example, UNICEF is oftentimes an evaluator of projects for its country offices. And so let's say the government's given money to a bunch of schools to go have internet, and you got to go and evaluate, are they using the internet? And you might have to hire a bunch of guys on motorbikes. They go out, into the mountains, and they go like, show me your internet dongle, like it's 1995, and then they come back a month later and say, okay, they still have the internet dongle, right? Isn't there a better way to have that evaluation process? So if you can get cell tower pings from Telefonica, and maybe you have certain data sets around school locations, then you can start putting together these two different data sets and saying, well, based on these data sets, we can kind of correlate this. We can triangulate the data. We can create some kind of simple software algorithm that allows us to evaluate whether or not these schools are using the internet and how many days a week are they using it for how long, right? So all these processes will make the evaluation of real world activities far more accurate, and it becomes linked to the value and the usefulness of the digital asset that represents those real world events. And so I think this part is really exciting, and there's also new mechanisms around how we can use crowdsourcing in a way to, and also staking and consensus around evaluating whether or not we think claims are true. So this is something called token curated registries, and that's an idea that's been going around. It's a consensus project as well, and with different applications across all different kinds of use cases and verticals. So the idea is we can use the crowd to subjectively evaluate certain claims based on their staking in the outcomes of that claim. So it's super exciting in terms of the variety of tools that we have at our disposal to evaluate whether or not certain things are happening on the ground, and using blockchain as a way to collect all this information, authenticate it, and show how they play in terms of the value chain, information chain.
Thank you, Fanny. And I think you guys just painted a really, really rosy picture for the whole blockchain technology, because as you were able to hear, and then also like put it together with the keynote that was delivered earlier, the possibility for the blockchain is really unlimited right now. The imagination will take you where it needs to take you, and I think that was sort of verified by all the thoughts that went through your sort of thoughts as you thought about your original solution and where you could go next. And also, like another thing that I think was brought up is there are other technologies that intertwine, right? Such as artificial intelligence, cloud solutions, and whatnot. And these are the things that as you proceed with the new technology, you're going to be also deploying additional technologies to make you not twice faster, to move twice faster, but maybe 3 times, 4 times faster, and then higher. So that's where you're going with this brave new world. So you all have different solutions on blockchain technology, and some of you will hit this capacity issue sooner than some other other people. Are you guys looking into how to resolve that potential capacity issue that will come sooner or later? And does anybody have some kind of ideas, thoughts, insight?
Sure. So one of the things that we're doing is really thinking about what should be on-chain and what should be off-chain. Not everything just because it's cool and you can put a hashtag after it should be blockchain, right? There's a lot of what we do that actually, in our case, the prices of healthcare and the list of where the doctors are located, that stuff you can scrape from Google, quite frankly, and it doesn't need to be on the chain. We're specifically using the blockchain technology for something that blockchain is good at, which is this peer-to-peer smart contracts, which you can use, put in escrow very quickly, no third parties. So we don't want to clog up the tubes, so to speak, with information that can live elsewhere on centralized databases, and using the right security around that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is one of the networks that we're creating a solution on is the Lightning Network. And one of the things that they do, it's a side chain of the Bitcoin blockchain. And what's nice about that is they actually take a lot of the transactions and leave them off of the blockchain until full settlement. And so therefore, you're not transacting over and over when it's not necessary. So it's just creating a channel between the two actors, say patient and provider, as opposed to the whole network. And when it's done, then you broadcast what happened. So those are two solutions that we're personally doing in our company. The other thing that you should think about is that it seems like we don't have capacity right now, but also dial-up modems were very slow, and it seemed like there was not a lot of capacity. I think at some point, while everyone likes to talk about decentralization, we will see centralization of decentralized computing. So we'll take those large data centers that Google and Apple and Amazon have built around the world, and Facebook for that matter. And instead of having racks of redundancy and on one server or one center altogether, you'll just have these different nodes that are technically decentralized, but they're in one place. So we'll have much larger computing power. The graphics cards and everything that's doing the mining will become much more efficient. So from the technology perspective, I'm not that concerned. I think over time, things will become more efficient. From an energy, energy should be a concern right now, but not in the future. But I think the biggest question is, are we clogging the tubes with things that don't need to be out there? Can we use existing really good solutions right now and pair that with where blockchain works really well?
Great. Any other comments or thoughts?
Yeah, so, we're running a variant of Ethereum where we're using the EVM, but use a different consensus mechanism, which in theory gets us about 100x the scale of Ethereum. And there's plenty of other blockchains like that coming out, like Archain and Cadena and EOS. So I think it's going to be, the problem of scale, I think, is it might retreat a little bit and really become a question of privacy, because the issue with public blockchains, especially keeping everything on chain, is that everyone sees your data. And for something like healthcare or financial services, that's not an acceptable outcome. Unless you want, for example, to show that your funds are held in escrow publicly, that's fine. And so I think work on, and also something like simply using ZK snarks and making everything anonymous, I don't think is a good solution either, because going back to the beginning of this panel, you don't have auditability from the regulator. And for that matter, they're extremely computationally intensive. And so I think that is where a lot of work is going to go into. And I think that is really going to be, once we figure that out, because I am quite confident we'll figure it out eventually, I think that will be one of the enabling factors for really mainstream adoption. And at that point, your blockchain system won't look too different from your normal system, I think. It's just going to be more resilient and probably cheaper to use.
Fantastic.
I-
Oh, go
I
ahead.
think from our end is as you see more and more tokens, user-generated tokens, in our case, impact tokens and so forth, it goes around the question, how do we bring more liquidity to these smaller tokens so that you can have local community currencies, you can have, project currencies and so forth, and you kind of encourage these little micro economic or economies within different networks. And so I think that becomes very interesting. There's certain projects out there that are solving this problem, Bancor being one of the early ones looking at smart contract-based reserves, and there's other models coming out in terms of how we think about providing more liquidity and support to the myriad new kinds of tokens that are coming on board. And one of the things that we're in the early stages of exploring is how do we create an impact exchange? So being able to, again, provide the fuel and the liquidity needed to really bring in capital to these kinds of important projects that are producing a lot of good and helping to fulfill the sustainable development goals. So it's super exciting to see the market developments year by year and just month by month.
Great. And Daniel? Yeah, go ahead.
I guess Adi really nailed it when he just spoke about, we're going to get better, and this is what we're doing at the moment internally, is figuring out what core functions need to run on chain and what needs to run off chain. At the moment, there's a lot where it's easy to see that there's a lot of things that don't need to be running through the blockchain, and that's what will get better over time as well. So that will be less resource intensive. At the same time, that there's a lot of technology, there's a lot of development going on anyway. For example, with Ethereum, they have a new proof of a consensus algorithm work that they're doing, which should roll out in mid-year, which will resolve some of the congestion issues that we're seeing. So there's constantly iterative development happening from a technology side. I think the goal is to get to a point where you're not even talking about a blockchain, in the same way that you don't tell your clients or customers that you're running your cloud stack on Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services. Nobody cares if you're running Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services. You're essentially trying to solve a problem, and it will, we're still, years away from this, 5-10 years, where blockchain is considered in that same framework, where it's just a way that some data aspects or some infrastructure elements are done, and it doesn't need to be attached as some sort of as a selling point.
Cool. Thank you for those comments. And at this point, we've been talking already about 55 minutes, so I want to open it up to the floor if anybody has a question.
I got a question.
All right, good. Oh, is there, I think the mic is not there. Oh, the mic is there, okay, yeah. Oh, but they can't hear on the other side.
They can't hear?
They can hear now.
Sure. Earlier in the discussion, we agreed that it takes up to 10 minutes because there's not enough computers in the collective today to validate transactions. We've gone from the 70s to now to validate credit card transactions in 1 to 2 minutes in third world countries. So by admission, the panelists said 10 minutes. So if you're putting all of my information with whatever it is, governmental, which 10 minutes is okay to pass a law, but if I'm dying in an operating room and you add all the medical transactions for 400,000 people here now, you've just slowed it down to an hour to get critical information. So there is a solution, and I said it earlier, but there's no way the United States, knowing that, as we said earlier, that the blockchain had been hacked almost every month recently, that we're going to put all of the US's medical records for President Trump and Obama on the blockchain. Until you can come up with much, much better levels of security, it's just simply not going to happen. And if you're going to start putting stuff offline and not on the block, now you've opened up a whole new set of security risks because you've got the potential of hacking whatever device is off of the block. And if that's compromised and you bring it into the block because you need it for a medical room, surgery or whatever, you could possibly be costing yourself some serious real lawsuits. And the cost of even doing this is going to be billions. And I could go on, right? We don't have motorbikes or mountains. I have a scooter. But exchanging carbon credits, we're nowhere near that. But I'll wrap up with the solution. And I said it earlier. We have a zero cost of energy in the Bahamas after 5 years of implementing solar. We are way below Hawaii as it pertains to the equator. We're closer to it. So we have longer days of more sun. So we should have had thousands and thousands of the world's best mining machines that come containerized in 40-foot containers that are solar powered, that are tweaked to cut on at 10 in the morning and off at 4 in the afternoon. And we would have been the country that would have sped up that 10-minute duration for a transaction validation. We would have been the country being rewarded for when you, in northern countries that have no sun, and southern, like Argentina, need to have a medical transaction validated. It would have been done right here in the Bahamas. We would have been rewarded for that, and we would have had $1 trillion industry. I want any of you to tell me I'm wrong. We would have been a country of 100,000 Bahamians and a slew of foreigners, legal and illegal. Our 100,000 Bahamian people would have been rich, just sitting down, watching the sun. So it's time to fix the Bahamas.
So was your question, you want them to say yes or
My
no?
question,
Yeah, okay.
these questions are questions that I had in 2009 when the blockchain came out, when crypto first came out with Bitcoin, when I started buying cryptocurrency. So the problem is, you guys are simply asking questions I asked in 2009. The question today is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Canada, Prime Minister Trudeau just went to India, spent a week there. He's not an idiot. Discussing the block. If that's a trading block between first world Canada and allegedly third world India, but $1 billion population with 1 billion smartphones that could possibly be those servers that will validate all these transactions, do you know where that's going to end up? So it's a trading block. It could be a voting block in the UN of billions of people, and it could be a blockchain that would rival anything in America with 350,000 people. And America won't team up with China because they're at war. So that's the biggest block in the world between Canada, the new Silk Road virtually. Guys, tell me I'm wrong. I'm gone.
Oh, okay, so I think that most of...
there's a few misunderstandings there. So, most modern blockchains don't really do mining anymore. We don't do any mining in our blockchain. These kind of consensus algorithms have been, in production since 2013. They're very well understood now. Our blockchain has 2-second blocks. And the second thing is that we keep very, very little data on the blockchain. All of the data that's encrypted by the user's private key is actually kept off-chain on a personal data server. And so, by the way, if the user's private key is compromised, there's still ways to kind of protect that data by kind of distributing that data between a few different trusted sources. So I'm not saying it's a perfect system either. All I'm saying is that I think you raised very legitimate points. Although there's been a little bit of progress since then. I think we'll have to have a chat with you about the best way to advance that and to implement that into production.
So the mining machine I spoke of, the mining is just a byproduct. It's a validation server, sir, that's solar powered, so it's no cost of using it. And it can be used to validate that medical record that you're trying to do in Argentina. The mining side of it is simply cookies, just extra bonus if you're going to use it to get a little Ethereum. But you can use the same server, the mining device, to mine and store and handle these transactions at light speed. Visa does it right now. And anything you put offline, sir, can be hacked.
Okay, so thank you. I think we have another question, so we are going to move on to another question. And thank you for your statement and question there.
Yeah, I actually have two questions. One is a technical question.
Okay.
So it's going to get kind of nerdy. But with the blockchain, I always kind of got confused on where it actually kind of fits. Do you consider the blockchain an application layer, or is it something else? Because it uses frameworks. So where do you see that it actually kind of sits? Because it's a database, but it's not really a database. So where would you think of where that actually fits?
Haruni, can we have everyone announce their names as well as where they're coming from?
Eardley Grant.
We just know how to address everyone.
Sorry.
Say that again.
Oh, Erdley Grant, University of the Bahamas.
Great. So very simply, and then there are probably more technical people on this panel than I am, but essentially, first of all, I think we should step back from calling it the blockchain. There are multiple blockchains, and they serve different purposes. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is the technical blockchain is just storing data in a public way. And the way to describe it is a decentralized distributed ledger, just like anything else. Just like you keep your ledger for your books, or if you're at a university, grades, you have a ledger. But if someone gets into the one grade book, then they can give themselves a 100 or an A in the class. But if there are multiple records on the ledger, then if one person hacks into one of those nodes, and then you confirm it with the rest of the network, and we know that it's wrong, that node actually gets kicked off. So it's a technology that allows you to have what's called a trustless network. And so when you say the blockchain or blockchain is simply that data storage technology. And then there are applications that are built on top of it. I think all of us, I don't think anyone on this panel is building a blockchain, though Dan mentioned some of the other companies that are building them out there right now, like Cadena, which is a whole bunch of people who left JP Morgan after building theirs. They're now building a private one that's hopefully supposed to be used for financial services because it needs to be private. So there are private blockchains. The big ones that we talk about today are the public ones are the Bitcoin blockchain and Ethereum. Neo is another big one. And most of the companies that you're seeing pop up today, especially with initial coin offerings, are applications. And what they're using is the blockchain to transact using smart contracts because they're peer-to-peer, and you don't need a central service to confirm those different transactions.
All right, my last
Yeah,
question. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, just gonna say that there's probably a little bit more nuance there, and there's probably also some debate as well, where you see something kind of in the middle, where you have pure just application layers. So you're building on a particular vertical with a particular use case, and you're building on the user interface. And then there's some terminology I've heard, like your DApp framework. So like if you're decentralized applications at that top layer, sometimes called a DApp. So others, when you're just one layer beneath that, you might be called a DApp framework or a thin protocol versus a fat protocol. So we always kind of have that struggle, because we're not quite at the application to the top layer. We just sit one layer beneath that, but we still rely on sort of core blockchain infrastructure, whether that's Ethereum or some other blockchain of the future like EOS or Neo. And then beneath that, you really have your sort of core internet protocols, right? So there's several layers that kind of get built up, and they have governance aspects that affect each other going up and down those layers.
All right. Yeah, thanks. The last question is not nerdy. It actually has to do with regulations. How do you, or do you see any sort of concern, maybe in another year, 2 years, 3 years, when this actually starts to develop, that you're going to run into some challenges with a lot of the regulatory bodies out there? And I'm not really talking about financial, but also something like GDPR in Europe that actually, deals with the regulation and monitoring of citizens' private data, no matter where it's actually sitting. Do you see that being a challenge with you expanding or deploying your application?
So I actually had this is Mao Mao. I actually had the pleasure of meeting someone who, I think the Secretary General or something, of the GDPR project in Davos. And we had a fun chat and agreed that basically no blockchain is comply with GDPR. And also GDPR itself is quite complex, especially the right to forget. But I think that's a great point. I think that, especially as you get into more regulated frameworks, especially as you deal with more fiat currency and you get more, so-called real adoption, so therefore real world risk, I think those frameworks are going to become, and especially as regulators get a better understanding of what the technology is and isn't, then absolutely, I think there will be, some regulators will come down on it. I think some other regulators will develop frameworks that extend out to cryptocurrencies and the blockchains and try to bring them into these frameworks. And I'm just very excited to see more clarity come out in this space, because ultimately as a business, we need predictability to operate properly.
Great, thank you, Mama.
So
And we
I'm
have-
a securities
sorry.
lawyer by
All right, go ahead.
training. Actually, Joel, who spoke earlier, is one of my, he's one of our lawyers and he's one of my mentors. On the GDPR issue, I was talking to someone from Oxford about 2 weeks ago, and one of the kind of quirky legal issues is that, if you publish something to a public chain, and then it's supposed to be an immutable record, and someone says, well, I want to take that off. So who then becomes liable in that context? Is it the miners? Is it Peter Todd from Bitcoin Core? Is it Vitalik, right? Like is it the co-developers? Is it the architects? Right? Who's liable in that case for taking that information off an immutable chain? So that's kind of a interesting, but probably maybe a slightly theoretical issue. Let's see how that plays out. But I think part of compliance with a lot of these privacy rules will be around how we manage self-sovereign identity, how we manage sort of the data stores and what's on-chain, off-chain, which Adi and others had spoken about earlier. And one of the biggest areas that I'm sure everyone's seen is around the regulation of ICOs, or these unregistered securities offerings. So FINMA's come out. FINMA is the regulator in Switzerland, so a lot of these projects has started in Switzerland following after the Ethereum Foundation. And so FINMA's come out with guidance very recently saying that if you claim to be a utility token, it has to have actual utility at the time of its issuance, provided that it doesn't have any other characteristics of an investment contract. So that's one regime. Of course, there's questions as to how much utility is sufficient utility. That's a question of fact that remains to be played out. The SEC has done a lot of work in this space. They've actually issued enforcement action letters, so they detail very clearly why they went after a certain project. And the manner of sale is going to be very, very important. For the SEC, you might have heard of the Howey test. Everyone knows about Howey test for some reason now. It's kind of funny when you have engineers talking to you about the Howey test, and you're like, what? Like, what?
Fenny, you must have hit something. Fenny, I think you hit something. Yeah, you went into like you sound like you're speaking out of the drum can or something. You must have hit something. No, you're back now. You're back.
Sorry.
Yeah. Anyway, sorry, I interrupted you because we couldn't understand a word of what you were saying the last 30 seconds. But if that was coming to the end, we just have one more question on the floor, and that will be the end of the panel.
Hello, everyone. My name is Bobby Chen, and first of all, I'd like to commend you guys for being solution drivers instead of just posing problems and not having a solution in sight. My question is, so as mentioned by Harumi and the other keynote speaker, the Bahamas is a key offshore financial hub. And with a large amount of banks looking to de-risk, private and commercial banks looking to de-risk, how do you guys envision the banks being able to strike a relationship or bridge the gap between blockchain technology, cryptocurrency, and also being in compliance and being fully regulated and keeping a lot of their investors / stakeholders, I guess, happy and feeling secured?
I think we're going to need new financial vehicles and perhaps new institutions. If you've ever dealt with a bank or talked to a banker, they are archaic institutions, and I don't think they're going to change, mainly because they have to be risk averse, right? Especially in the States and in other places where you have something like the FDIC or some kind of insurance that says people can't lose all of their money. Those institutions that are insuring it or keeping the money that is insured are not going to take on some of these major risks that we see happening with the financial aspect right now. That said, I think Fenny really got to the crux of it too, is a lot of this financial stuff is going to disappear over time, and it needs to be more about the technology. People figured out a very early loophole, and I think people who really cheated will be prosecuted eventually. The SEC just yesterday, there were major headlines about them sending subpoenas to half of the ICOs that happened in 2017. Now, granted, they hadn't had any discussions with the companies, but they want to know and they're not sure where to go with it. I think we're going to see maybe not less investing, but a lot less of hidden stuff that's going on. For example, our company is founded in the United States. We're a Delaware corporation, and when we go into our ICO, we're going to be very clear about that. And as we raise money, it's going to be treated, even if multiple people can participate like a traditional round, we will pay taxes. We're not going to have offshore accounts. We're not going to hide what we're doing. Our motto is transparency. We're all about healthcare transparency and the transparency in the market. And I think as you're looking at companies, you should look for values like that too. If something seems sketchy, I wouldn't get involved. And if a company is telling you that they can't give you disclosures, then I wouldn't deal with it. That's not really an answer in terms of financial institutions, but it kind of is an answer in terms of where we're going financially with blockchain. I think this whole thing of crazy ICOs and hidden money is going to disappear.
Great. Okay, thank you, everyone. I think that concludes the panel and then also today's conference for today. I would like to thank Daniel, Mama, Adi, and Feni for being patient with the technology, being connected and sitting behind the camera for the last, actually, probably for some of you, an hour and 45 minutes rather than an hour and 15 minutes. So I really thank you for your participation. And I'm sure we will have lots more questions that will come to our way. So I would appreciate your time at that time as well. So with that, I will conclude today's conference. I just would like to thank everyone for being here today. And we ran a little bit longer. Thank you for staying here until the very end. And I personally would like to thank two people sitting right in front of me here, for John for giving me this opportunity to put together this conference, and Rhonda, my friend, who's the founder of the organization called Harness All Possibilities, who actually connected me to governor role to begin with, which made this whole conference happen. So actually, this is not, the conference is not the end of this blockchain talk, but this is just the beginning. And there will be phase 2, phase 3 being planned down the line. But as a part of this conference, you will be receiving a post-event, post-conference survey. And some of you might get involved in even the focus group to kind of talk about more in-depth stuff than what the paper survey can handle. So that's gonna come, and then from there, the next steps will be determined. My email address is written on the screen. It's harumi@hutconsulting.com. If you have any questions for myself or any of the panelist speakers that you encounter today, or just blockchain questions generally speaking, please send them to me, and then I will get them addressed. I will address them, or I will get them addressed one way or another. So thank you very much once again. This concludes today's conference. And Joan and I are here today, whether in and out. So if you find us, just say hi. Just say, if you have a question, let us know. Otherwise, you have a very, very nice afternoon. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again very soon.